Hello and welcome to episode 66 of the Page One podcast. I'm Tarek.
I'm Marco, and thanks for joining us for another episode of the Page One podcast. If this is your first episode, please do go and check out our back catalogue at the Page One podcast. We do like to speak to writers of all kinds, authors, screenwriters, journalists, video game writers, comedy writers, comedians. Have I missed any out? I think
that's probably all of them.
But there's a lot of great guests we've had on the podcast in the past, so please do check that out. We try and speak to them about how they broke into the industry, what their process is, and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. And we've got someone this week who goes across a few of those categories, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, definitely ticks a lot of the boxes that you just mentioned. It is Annalee Newitz we're chatting with this evening. This evening? I don't know why I said that. It's not even late right now at time of recording. But anyway, Annalee Newitz is an American journalist, editor, author, fiction and nonfiction, and they've written for a number of periodicals, Popular Science and Wired, but perhaps best known for their work on io9, which is as we mentioned last week, a kind of science fiction and science fact blog. Which was really big. It's still big now, but it was big when we were both.
Yeah,
well, I was at uni anyway.
And Annalee was the founding editor of io9, and they talked to us about how that came about and how that opportunity presented itself. And yeah, it's a sort of blog that if you're into, it came at the right time for the zeitgeist of people interested in popular science and also pop culture like superheroes, comics, video games. It covers all of these sorts of things.
It was a really kind of go-to website when I was at uni because you could get your update on the Marvel movie stuff and then some movie spoiler special stuff and then some black hole information. And it was all a really good mix of just everything that I kind of was into.
Actually, as a writer, if you're into if you're sort of science fiction, futurist type stories that you want to tell, it's a great source of ideas because it does cover that sort of popular science area of stuff as well as the pop culture stuff as well. But we talked to Annalee about that and how they choose between whether an idea should be for fiction or non-fiction, and also how you can sometimes explore important ideas in fiction in a way that will get to a larger audience than sometimes we'd look at the same idea in a non-fiction piece.
Yeah, it's that kind of classic Star Trek, idea of here's a really complicated analogy about AIDS, but we're going to use aliens and as a moral drama, and you kind of dress it up and you kind of almost slip it in the back door a little bit of these. Yeah,
you reach people that it might not reach otherwise in that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really interesting chat. So we'll just play a quick advert for our writer's notebook and then get straight into the podcast, and we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest, who is also linked to io9 as well.
But for now, on with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page 1.
Looking at your career, you seem to have had a sort of dual interest in science and writing. And I just wondered, to begin with, growing up with those interests, what is it that pushed you more towards the writing side while always keeping the interest in science as well?
Yeah, I actually wonder about that a lot myself. And I was realizing the other day when I was talking to a friend that in my novels, I have a lot of characters who are scientists that get kind of sucked into social science things and humanities things. And I'm in the middle of writing a novel right now where there's a character who's a scientist, and these other characters come along and are like, actually, we need to talk about government. And she gets sucked into this whole government thing. I was like, I think I'm trying to work out something here. Because I was like a lot of nerdy kids, I was super into science when I was growing up. I really loved geology and I liked ancient history. And I was just always really fascinated by it. But both my parents were English teachers. And I think they kind of thought science was silly. And although they would certainly buy me science books and encourage me, what they really encouraged me in was writing and reading fiction. And we had a huge bookshelf in our house that was like a 2-story bookshelf that my dad had built and installed. And it was pretty much all fiction. So I think it was definitely partly encouragement at home. And also the fact that there is a huge overlap between science and culture. And so it was kind of easy for me to slide from one to the other. But I have to admit, I do have a lot of regrets about not having done as much science education when I was younger that I would have liked to. And so I've had to spend a lot of time kind of making up for that. So I did do the most technical possible thing I could do with an interest in the humanities, which is I got a PhD in English and American Studies, which is just a fancy way of saying kind of literature and using some ideas borrowed from the social sciences. And so my path took me in this very technical direction, but because I was always interested in science and especially in technology, I always had like sort of one foot in the world of journalism. And that, of course, once I was about to graduate with my PhD, it became really obvious that a career in academia was going to be extremely hard to find. In the United States, there just weren't that many jobs. And it turned out that it was actually easier to make a living as a journalist than it was to make a living as a professor. So it was sad because I actually love teaching, but at the same time, I also love writing even more. So that was kind of how it happened. I mean, partly it was accidental and partly it was the economy and partly it was that, writing is really awesome.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
so I always was doing writing. So it seemed natural.
And how did you make those first steps into journalism then?
So it was the 1990s. So I started a zine.
Right.
And it sounds like a huge cliche, but at the time, my friends and I, when I was in grad school, we didn't actually know what zines were. We just wanted to write articles about culture and science that weren't academic because, academic writing can be very dense and it's really usually aimed at a super niche audience. And so we wanted to reach a slightly bigger niche. So we created a zine called Bad Subjects, which actually is still going somewhere out there. It quickly, again, this was the 90s, so things were very crude and primitive, but we did put it online very, very early on before people really were going on the web. We put it on a thing called Gopher, which people who are old will know about. And so that was what I did for many years. And it was basically kind of culture journalism. And I was writing some about actually the topics I write about now, but no one was paying me. I was just doing it because I didn't know how to get published anywhere else. I just thought, okay, well, I'll just go ahead and do it on my own.
I mean, the sort of stuff that I've read that you've written in terms of journalism is something that I wasn't aware of until I started going more into the internet. You know, it kind of suited to being on the internet because of its subject matter in a lot of ways. And you wouldn't generally in the past have found that in, you know, broadsheet newspapers or something, at least not a lot of it.
No, I mean, and I think I'm unusual that I sort of started as a digital, I started as a digital journalist at a time when very few people were doing that. And it would have been the more typical path for someone like me would have been to go work at a newspaper or a magazine. But I think in a way I got lucky because my academic background meant that it was a pretty long transition for me into mainstream writing. I had to first pull all the academic language out of my work and kind of just grow up a little bit. And so by the time I was leaving school and applying for professional jobs, it was the turn of the millennium, and there was a pretty robust, if unstable, internet journalism world, I guess you could say. At that point, I mean, people would sort of talk about it as like digital journalism. Is it real? Can we trust it? And I just kind of never looked back. I have always published in newspapers and magazines, but my primary venue has been the internet. And it's perfect because the subjects I'm interested in appeal to people who were early adopters of the internet, technology and science, and science fiction. But also, I love the immediacy of digital journalism. I love getting responses from readers, which a lot of my peers found really alienating and creepy. And I was like, why wouldn't you want to do that? So yeah, it's definitely, I've always been very online, which made me feel like I was from the future for a very long time. And now I think I finally caught up, or history's caught up to me or something. Yeah. So I think I'm finally in sort of the right timeline.
And when you look at the path that you took to get, and we're going to get to io9, etc. But the path that you took when you were first starting, is that a similar path that you would recommend to people starting out in the area now? You know, writing stuff not for money, but just for exposure to try and get some experience before you can then try and pitch stuff, or what's the path now?
I think there's a lot of paths, and there were then too. And I was extremely lucky that I was in school and had, support from the university to live on. So I didn't need to have, I had a day job, but it was being in school, which is really different from having a day job, like working at a bank or something like that. So it was fine for me to spend some of my time doing writing. But I think for other people, writing for free just isn't an option. So I would say that, sure, if you have the luxury to do that, it is a great way to start writing. And certainly I think that is now a pretty established path in fiction. So many people start out doing fanfic now, and the fanfic community is so, sophisticated. Like it's big, it's complicated. People have excellent critical feedback. Like my niece is really into fanfic, and she's part of a group of people who, really give each other great critiques on their work. So I think that's one way, like joining like a fanfic type community, which is writing for free, but it's also participating in a community. So to me, it doesn't quite feel as exploitive. But doing what I did, where I created my own publication and wrote in it, I guess now it would be equivalent to doing like a Medium blog or just, rolling your own blog from scratch, whatever software you want to use. I think that can be a good exercise, but I also think that especially if you want to make a living as a writer, it's good to try to start getting paid as soon as you can and to not be afraid to ask for money, because it's a job, and people should be paid for it. And ideally, you do some practice writing, as we all practice things for free at first, but that really the goal is find publications that you want to write for that will pay for it. And sometimes that means, certainly when I was starting out, I did commercial writing, I did marketing writing. I would basically do any kind of writing if you would pay me. I never got to do porn, which I wanted to, but I would, and that still might be in the cards. But the point is that any kind of paying work is good work when it comes to writing, and the more credits that you get, the better you get, not just at writing, but at navigating the world of getting paid for writing, which is its own dark art for sure.
And that pathway took you at one point to become sort of founder and editor-in-chief of io9, which, for those who are listening, might not know, it's a big... it was part of the Gawker, or is it still part of the Gawker? I'm not sure.
It's now, Gawker, it's the network formerly known as Gawker.
Yes.
Now it's called Go Media.
Right, okay.
But yeah, it's still part of the network that it started with.
How did that come about?
That was also a very kind of random story. I had been writing for Wired magazine, and I was a contributing editor there, and I had written for a lot of other kind of nerdy places like Popular Science, and I had a column about technology that ran in a lot of free weeklies in the US. And so I had kind of a small reputation, and I got contacted kind of, to me, it felt like out of the blue, by the then managing editor of Gawker Media, who said, "Oh, we're thinking of doing some things. Why don't we meet?" And Gawker had a pretty crazy reputation the whole time that I worked there. And so I kind of thought, I just took the meeting as a lark. Like, I figured they were going to ask me to do something terrible that I wouldn't like, but I'd have a good story to tell. And so I was meeting up with this managing editor like at a pub, and I had like smoked a joint at some point during the day. So I kind of showed up not in a very businessy mood at all. And I was just like, this is going to be dumb. And then it wasn't. He actually was quite compelling. And he said, we're starting some kind of futurism site, and would you be interested in that? And I was like, what? And it really felt like somebody had like yanked all the clouds out of my brain in that moment. I was like, yes, this is totally interesting. And so we started kind of working. I started working with them internally with Nick Denton, who ran the company at the time, and several of the editors on what the nature of this blog would be. And I, from the beginning, they were interested in futurism and science fiction. And from the very beginning, I said, we have to cover science. It has to be at least 50% science and fact, and then 50% pop culture, because that's just gonna get you such a great combination of ideas. And Nick was a bit dubious, but then I won out, and he was glad, because it turned out that actually the science coverage was really what pulled in our audience. And it was kind of like people came for the science and stayed for the pop culture. And sometimes it was the other way around. Like, sometimes people would get sucked in because it was like, oh, Judge Dredd. Oh, here's a story about, quantum physics. And because, the big overlap between like Judge Dredd and quantum physics. Apparently, so the Venn diagram is like amazing.
That mix was I really liked that mix. Because you're totally right in that there must be a crossover though between people who are into science fiction and actual science. There must be a lot of if you are interested in both, for sure.
For sure, absolutely. And that was something that in feedback from in those early days, which is now, gosh, like 12 years ago now, that was the thing that people really liked. And I think it was part of what made io9 really unique was that we were really, and we weren't just committed to science writing that was kind of like gee whiz Daily Mirror stuff. It wasn't like, hey, we found a mummy's hand. Yeah. We were, trying to write legitimate science journalism and break stories and talk to researchers and be as accurate as we could be. And that's, to me, what's really fun, because we had people, writers and filmmakers and TV show writers who would come, and you knew they were coming because they wanted to read whatever we were saying about the stuff they were working on, but then they would stick around and get ideas from the science articles for new ways to take their writing. And so it was always cool when people would say like, yeah, I learned about this crazy nano stuff that now I'm sticking in my story. And I'm like, yes, my work here is done.
And so on a day-to-day basis, I mean, when you were sort of editor-in-chief, but you were also writing articles for it as well, I mean, how do you juggle all of that together and sort of curate everything together?
It was hard. So it was, it really was a job that lasted from first thing in the morning to almost like 11 or 12 at night every night, because the way we ran io9, and when I say we, Charlie Jane Anders was also basically co-running it. She's also a terrific science fiction writer and fantasy writer. She and I would just try to schedule posts to come about every, the longer we went on, it was like about every half hour, but initially I think it was like every hour or so. And we had a staff of, anywhere from, depending on the era of io9, anywhere from like 3 to 9 people, and plus freelancers. And so we were both editing and writing. We were both trying to write at least like 5 to 8 posts a day, some of which were quite long and some of which were really silly, like, here's a picture of a thing. So, which actually sometimes the picture of a thing posts would be the ones that got the most traffic, which would always be kind of, I don't know, you feel sad about it, but it's also fine. And so it was very exhausting. Like, it was physically exhausting as a job. And I'm sure that that's what it's like for people who work on like, daily TV shows and stuff like that, where it's just like there's a million things that you're juggling. And it was, we sustained it for many, many years, but at a certain point, I did have to kind of dial it back a little bit and kind of focus a bit more on the editing side. And that was kind of when I got less interested in the project overall. I like building publications. I like creating places where I can be a writer, and then I just want to be a writer there. And so that was part of what precipitated my urge to kind of leave and just do pure writing, because the meetings and the management and all that stuff, just it's not how my brain works. I don't really want to, I want to write things. So
well, that whole time you were, am I right in saying because you put out a number of short stories, and so am I right in saying that whole time you were kind of wanting to shift into the short story, and then eventually your first novel in 2017, and was it a kind of gradual process of leaving io9 or that world and moving more into short story and kind of fiction writing?
It was, I was always working on book projects. While I was at io9, I wrote a nonfiction book called Scatter, Adapt, and Remember, which is about mass extinction. It's a pop science book. And I also wrote Autonomous while I was there, which was my first novel. And I always wanted to write books. I guess I wouldn't say it was gradual. It didn't feel gradual, but I guess it was gradual. There were a couple of moments when I just took time off to work on book projects. And when I say I took time off, it was more like well, for example, there was a financial crisis where I just had to go down to halftime. So when I went down to halftime, I was like, I'll spend the other half of my time writing a novel. So Autonomous came out of at least the first draft of Autonomous came out of the financial crisis. And then, so I guess I'm having to retcon this. Like, what did I really do? I feel like I was doing a lot of flailing. And so, but to make it sound like I knew what I was doing, I did really always want to write books. And I've been trying to do that for pretty much my whole career. I've always been pitching books, and pretty much unsuccessfully. I did publish a couple of academic books back when I was a professor, but I didn't really get anyone interested in publishing a book from me until I was running io9. So so that let's just say that it was all part of a plan and it came together.
Well planned. That's fantastic.
Yes, right? Yeah, kids, don't do it that way. Have a better plan.
And you have written, obviously you've written the novels, and you're still writing nonfiction. Your latest book, which we'll talk about, is a nonfiction book. But I mean, what I wondered was, when you come up with an idea that you're interested in, you're wanting to explore, what is it that makes you think this will work as a novel, or this is something I want to explore in a sort of nonfiction way?
It's a good question. Usually I the way I usually start is, okay, I want to write a book. What are some ideas I have that would be book length? So it won't be so much like I get seized by an idea that then demands to be a particular length. It does happen sometimes that way. But I have to say, I think the only times I've been seized by an idea that came out of nowhere, it was almost always a short story for some reason.
Right.
And then otherwise, it is much more deliberate. I'm quite a boring writer in that way. Like, I do a lot of very deliberate thinking about what ideas will fit into what amount of space. I do a lot of outlining, which I know a lot of writers think is really ridiculous. And I do a lot of thinking through what's going to make sense. And so I'm never caught by surprise like that I'm going to write a book. Although it is true that the nonfiction book I'm working on right now, which won't be out for at least a year and a half or so, I was a bit surprised that I wanted to write about it. I'm writing a short history of psychological warfare in the United States. And I had been writing about psychological warfare a lot in my nonfiction, having to do with like social media and how people are manipulating each other's political opinions. And I was actually talking to a researcher who was like, wow, you know a lot about this. You should write a book. And I was like, oh, yeah. maybe so. But I have to say, with all of my other books, it's definitely been like pretty deliberate, especially with my fiction. And with my new nonfiction book, Four Lost Cities, that was a project that I worked on for many, many years. And it came out of articles I was writing. So usually the nonfiction articles I'm writing kind of tell me what I'm obsessed with, because if I keep returning to the same topic over and over again, I know I'm obsessed with it enough to write about it. But with fiction, it's like I'm much more of a novel writer than a short story writer. So like if I have a really awesome fiction idea, it's pretty much always going to be a novel.
And is your process when you're writing fiction compared to nonfiction, is it the same? Do you do the same kind of outlining, or is it, and the planning process, or is it completely different in terms of if you're doing something that you know is real compared to something that's just coming out of your own head?
That's a really good question. And actually, as you asked it, I realized why I probably am such an outliner, because most of my career has been nonfiction. And of course, with nonfiction, I think it's much more typical to do outlining. And so with my nonfiction, I'm very much of an outliner again. Even if I'm writing something short, I'll kind of jot some notes down about where I want to go. And I think that then when I turned to writing Autonomous, and I'd never written a novel before, my brain was like, well, of course I'll produce an outline, even though I often change my mind as I'm going through the outline. So I think that I'm an outliner because I got all of my writing habits from nonfiction.
Yeah.
And with your actual novels as well, one thing that struck me from reading, I've read Future of Another Timeline quite recently, which I really enjoyed. But there's it's clear, your background in science is clear from the book itself, and you know how do you balance, here's all this science information research that I've got, with here's an actual story that will move forward at a reasonable pace and not bog it down and all that sort of stuff? Is that just experience from your many years of writing?
Probably a little bit. I mean, one of the things about science journalism is that you do have to make very complicated ideas accessible to people. And it's the same thing actually with teaching. I think a lot of this goes back to the fact that I spent so many years teaching in university, and thinking about ways to present ideas that would be engaging for undergraduates, and engaging for me too, to be honest. So I think, but there is that like balance in fiction. If you're someone like me who loves to talk about science, you have to balance out the info dumping and the character development. And I definitely, it's funny that no one's ever accused me of being an info dumper, because I really feel like I am. And I'm like, the novel I'm working on right now, like I'll have these long scenes where it's literally just me talking about ecosystems. And I'll be like, how do I make this exciting? Well, my characters are walking through an ecosystem and they're looking at the ecosystem, and they're heading to a really cool thing, and they're having like tension, but it'll be like almost like the tension between the characters. Cause there's like, I'm writing these two characters who have like romantic tension. And so it's like, there's romantic tension between them, but it's all in the service of describing like in a transitional ecosystem that's moving from like tropical to savanna. And like, I spent so many days researching what that would look like and like how it would feel to be walking on the squishy trail and stuff. And then I'm sure when people read it, they'll be like, ooh, it's just like romantic angst. And like, they won't realize that I'm actually telling them all about like tropical ecosystems. So, or maybe they will. Maybe they'll be like, why is there so much stuff in here about ficuses? But I definitely like, I am such a nerd about researching shit. Like, it really is true that I spent like hours researching tropical ecosystems to write a tiny scene of a tropical ecosystem. So I think I balance it maybe just by luck. I mean, just by sheer flailing in a way that somehow works, because it's definitely not as deliberate as it should be, I'd say.
But like your books, you know, writing about ecosystems or writing about, you know, the topics that you pick in your books are obviously stuff that you're interested in, that are important to you. But do you think, you know, there's a storyline in Future of Another Timeline. Part of the plot is about a group of men trying to wipe out the rights of the LGBTQ community and stuff. Do you find that putting that stuff in fiction is a better way to reach a broader audience, do you think?
I definitely think it is, yeah. I think that when you have, I think political ideas about social relationships, I think it's easier to convey those ideas and also to receive those ideas, like as a reader, if it's in the context of something that's imaginary, because it's a lot less threatening. Mm-hmm. And I definitely, I mean, I do write in my nonfiction about climate change and the environment, but I think people kind of just shut their eyes when they see an article about climate change. It's like, oh God, not this again. Mm-hmm. And that's understandable. I mean, it's an upsetting topic, and it feels like there's nothing we can do about it. And so I think in fiction, if you show characters, engaging with the world, and there's something that you can hold on to that feels human, but also feels imaginary, it does allow us to have that kind of free play of belief systems where we kind of allow ourselves to entertain the idea that maybe other points of view are legitimate or even better than whatever we've been taught previously. So I definitely, I don't think I would ever write a nonfiction book that was all about, I don't think I would ever write a nonfiction book that dealt with some of the topics in Future of Another Timeline, even though they're very important to me, like violence against women or violence against young people. I think that that's a story that exists in my head as a story, not as a set of facts. I mean, it is based on facts, but it's also, I don't know. I want people to be able to think about those ideas in a way that feels safe. I keep returning to the word safe because I think fiction creates a kind of safe environment where we have pillows on the walls instead of stone.
But also, I think at the same time, it can bring a topic. It can make a topic more relevant to you as well. I think another article, like you say, about climate change is just another article that you've seen on the newspaper. But if it's wrapped up in a story about characters that you care about and it affects them, then obviously it'll make you start thinking about that topic as well.
I think that's true. That's what I think is so interesting about fiction, is that it makes things feel more personal and visceral and intimate, like more emotional, but at the same time more distant, So we can engage with these topics in ways that we just wouldn't if we were kind of in our more skeptical or rational state of mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think the thing I worry about in fiction, and I don't know if other fiction writers worry about this, but if I am dealing with a political topic, like say gender politics or the politics of fascism or something like that, both of which come up in Future of Another Timeline, I worry sometimes that readers will come away with the wrong message. And which I guess is just something you always have to worry about as a writer, and just let go of. It's okay, not everyone's going to get what you're getting at. Yeah. But I think that in fiction, it's easier for your ideas to become kind of appropriated for something that you never intended. Whereas in nonfiction, you can kind of say to the reader, no, I'm actually saying that this is bad. Here's a thing that I'm describing and it's bad. You can literally write this. Well, you wouldn't write the sentence it's bad because that's a terrible sentence, but you can sort of say it in some other way. And in fiction, if I were to write something and then to kind of do the fictional equivalent of saying it's bad, that's just terrible. No reader wants to hear that, And so you kind of have to just hope that they get which characters are the good characters and which ones are the bad characters, and that they don't end up saying wow, but being Sauron would be awesome, right? Because, some people came away with that, and they were just fuck yeah. And so I think that's kind of what I mean, is that I feel like in fiction that you do run that risk that people will kind of wind up getting the opposite message.
We spoke to Daniel Abram, who wrote the Expanse books, and he was saying exactly the same thing, but he also said that, it's not something you've got any control over as a writer. You write the story that you want to write and you put it out there, and then what other people do with it, you might have a hope that they interpret it in some way, but it's out of your control. And there's, I think his view was that once it's out there, it's not his problem in that sense.
Yeah, and that's definitely how I feel. I would never try to control how a reader understands my books, and I have had people say some pretty wacky stuff to me about oh, I loved when this thing happened that in my mind was a terrible, upsetting thing, and that they took as being a really positive thing. And I'm just okay, I'm glad that your mind is happy. Stay in that happy place.
You sicko.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. I mean, it is quite a strange experience to have people just have the opposite reaction.
Yeah, no, I've been watching. It's called It's a Sin. I don't know if it's out in America yet. It's a 5-part show in the UK about kind of the rise of AIDS during the 80s, and it follows it follows some folks, some kind of younger folk over about 5 or 6 years or so, and it's a really interesting because it's kind of a topic I kind of felt I kind of knew about, but then when you actually do watch it, as it kind of goes through what people's views were and how it changed over time, and it kind of drove home what it was like at that point. And it's definitely, I think doing it in the kind of guise of fiction is a really good entryway to a world where I probably wouldn't have watched a documentary about it necessarily, but I would have watched a show about it, and you kind of learn stuff, and it makes you want to then go and read and watch more stuff about it. And it really is it's a great starting point, I think, having these big ideas wrapped up in you're almost tricking you into learning stuff and getting involved in a topic you didn't think you would necessarily want to know more about. But it's
that's definitely right. Is it that's a Russell T. Davies?
Yeah, that's right. It is. Yeah.
I was gonna say, because that's what I mean. Russell T. Davies is awesome, and he's always done that. Like he always is like he always picks projects where he can have amazing characters and then like sneak actual real information in. Totally. And I mean, that's what Doctor Who is all about. Like Doctor Who was originally supposed to be an educational kids show, and it was like, and also there's all these cool characters, but like you're learning about history, kids, you know, and there's some science in here too. And there is some. It's awesome.
No, totally. And I read in an interview you gave a while back with someone that you kind of, when you're writing your fiction, you often think about the consequences of technology, and I guess kind of a similar Black Mirror kind of way of, you know, here's something which everyone loves. What's the end result if we run it down the line? And I wondered what your process is with that. You know, do you pick something that you find quite interesting and do you run it down to almost a ridiculous end and then try and pull it back, or do you just go step by step and think where would this technology go in society would change over time?
Kind of both. I try never to take things out to their most extreme absurd ends, because I'm actually not a good absurdist writer. I think that's just not my forte, but I am good at extrapolating unintended consequences that feel realistic.
Yeah.
And so what I will often do, actually what I've done in both of my novels that deal with the future, is I have written timelines out. And of course, with Future of Another Timeline, it was a little different. I did have a timeline for that too, but they weren't really going into the future at all. But the novel I'm working on now, which is set about 52,000 years in the future, I did make a little timeline for myself of like when certain things were invented. It's not super detailed. It's not like minute by minute. But I did want to establish like in my mind sort of how technology changed, how governments changed, like when it's about terraforming. So I'm kind of thinking about how terraforming became like a commercial industry, basically. Like how do real estate and terraforming kind of merge? And so I thought about it pretty carefully, like how would that work? And one of the things that really helps me, and I've talked about this before, is thinking about how much things have changed between the past and the present. So when I was thinking about 50,000 years, I thought about, okay, well, what were people doing 50,000 years ago? We had all kinds of stuff. Like we had lots of tools. People were using boats to go all over the world. Like people had already reached Australia in boats, and they had a lot of tools. The thing that I kept thinking about is that humans had a really sophisticated tool set with stone tools, which when you hear like stone tools, it sounds like, ugh, that's just like hitting things with rocks. But people made incredibly sophisticated shit with stone tools for like tens of thousands of years, and didn't really reach a point where they were using metals or ceramics for a long, long time, but were still very successful. They still had agriculture. They still had kind of proto-cities. So I was thinking, and I guess readers will have to decide if this actually makes sense, but I was thinking that like maybe once people get to space and are able have the technology to kind of live on other planets comfortably, that maybe we would reach a kind of equilibrium the way we had during the Paleolithic, where we spend a really long time with a basic tool set, a basic set of materials, but then we develop many, many tools out of it. So like that there's some kind of space equivalent of the Paleolithic or of the Stone Age, where we're like not developing like invisibility and like crazy levels of technology, but we're actually just, okay, we have a tool set for living on other planets, and we're just refining that for like tens of thousands of years. And so they're not doing things like turning into liquid terminators, or like going into other dimensions, or like subliming, or like they're not yet at the phase where they're like an Ian M. Banks type thing, where they're like, and we've built a galaxy-wide computer. So it's not, and I think, so that was how I kind of arrived at that idea. I was like, okay, it is the far future, but just because it's far in the future doesn't mean that people would be using technology that was totally unrecognizable to us. And that there's actually a historical precedent for why that might be true. So it feels plausible to me. Who knows? In 50,000 years, humans will, look back and be like, haha, actually, we've all become squid creatures that live in 6 dimensions. I don't know.
It's funny because I often do like to look back at these, we get, it's like in the year 1970, here's what we think will happen in the next 60 years. And you read it and they're always terrible. They're often because they haven't been imaginative, like, enough. They've said we think we'll get even more space on a floppy disk or whatever, and it's like they're so far beyond
not
that.
Untrue.
Well, that's true. But it's always funny how hard it is to really gauge how far people will go or technology will go, and so I think I like the idea a lot of kind of imagining a time where you kind of get to a level playing field almost, and it's which is obviously based in historical fact. And, that's a nice way of doing it.
I mean, and again, it could be totally wrong, right? It could be like,
no one knows.
You could have a black swan thing where it's like, oh, and then we discovered, like in The Expanse, and then we discovered an alien technology, and all bets are off. I just don't have the alien technology thing. I have the slow march of the Paleolithic in space.
I mean, I read something, I can't remember where I read it, but, if you took someone from 1900 and put them in 1950, and then put someone from 1950 in 2000, it seems that in that last 50, from 1900 to 1950, it wouldn't seem like a huge leap to that person. But if the last 50 years, or I think whenever it was that I read it, but
sure.
You do get these periods where suddenly there has been this little jump, even though there's been the same amount of time has passed.
I don't know if that's true. I think there's definitely periods of time in human history when we've had rapid technological development and also rapid expansion of urban spaces and stuff like that. But I think every generation believes that our generation is like the weirdest and that we've made things like I was listening to a podcast where the two hosts were saying like, oh, imagine going back 10 years and trying to explain to someone about hype houses and like TikTok memes and stuff like that. And I was like, you wouldn't have any trouble explaining that. Like it would take you 3 sentences. Come on. And I think I do think that some things are odd, but they're still taking the same shape over and over. Like humans are still trying to figure out instantaneous connection. That's something we've been trying to figure out for a long time. We're still trying to go into space. We're still trying to go faster than we can go on our feet.
We've got folding phones now. I mean, that's pretty spacey.
True. I know. No one saw that coming. But the idea of the phone, like, I feel like you could explain that to someone in the late 19th century. It's like, it's a telegraph in your hand, which you always wanted. And like, everyone would be like, dude, that's so cool. We always wanted a telegraph in our hand. And like, if you went back further than that, it would be like, it's like a letter, but it goes really fast. Like texting is like Twitter would have made sense in the Neolithic. Like people would have been like, oh yeah, we exchange tiny pieces of information written down on stone. It's like, so you guys are doing it with this weird foldy thing, but we always wanted folding stones. So, like this is awesome. So I don't mean to like disparage human achievement. We have achieved a lot, but we also do keep returning to the same obsessions, the same areas of technological development. So, food is another one of those areas, which is like a whole other thing, like how we keep developing new ways of making food and growing food and distributing food. And we just, we like to eat. So we just keep working on that.
Well, that brings us nicely onto your latest book, which is Four Lost Cities. Do you want to tell us a bit about that and why you wrote that?
Yeah, so this is a nonfiction book that I spent many years researching, and it's about what new discoveries in archaeology can tell us about why people first built cities, but also why people abandoned cities. So the book focuses on 4 life histories of cities that were abandoned. So that way I can sort of tell the whole story of the city from its birth to its abandonment, and talk about why it is that people keep doing this crazy thing.
It brings together, again, going back to what we were saying earlier, but I mean, it seems to me to be a book that your interest in geology and all of that sort of stuff seems to still be coming through in the topic for this book as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you'll see, I don't think anyone will be surprised that the person who wrote the science fiction novels I wrote this book. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of, I use a lot of storytelling skills in it. And it's, of course, about human history, but it's also about how archaeologists and geologists and, chemists and a lot of other scientists, how they learn about history, like how we use evidence from science to kind of recreate stories about what our ancestors did. And so, yeah, it's totally my obsessions. It's definitely the nonfiction equivalent of a portal fantasy, or like just a basic time travel story, mm-hmm. Where we get to kind of go back and see these really different social worlds than our current one here in the West, where I live. And so, it's definitely, it scratches the itch of writing a novel, but the fun part about it is that it's all real. It's all based in fact. And I really went to all these places and talked to scientists and tried to bring their stories to life in a way that would feel like reading something fun and fictional.
And it's quite interesting as well from the point of view of what we were speaking about earlier as well, because, people in their time, and like in our time now, we think this is the height of civilization. This is what civilization is. But if you look back in history, and there have been civilizations that probably thought exactly the same thing, and they've been completely wiped out. It seems to be something that humans you can't ever not think you're living in the best time in the sense of being civilized and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I guess I would push back on that, because I think there are definitely times when people have not felt like they were living at the height of civilization. There's definitely places on Earth where people would tell you, everything is really screwed up here. And actually, no, this is not the height of anything. And I mean, here in the States, we just lived through 4 years where a lot of us felt like, oh, this is not the country we signed up for. And that was really shocking and weird, and kind of a good reminder that civilization doesn't kind of proceed along a perfect path of mm-hmm. like some ideal, always getting better, mm-hmm. always getting more just, always getting more foldy phones. And then I also think that it's true what you said, that then there are these moments in history where, especially in places like cities, where so many people come together and create just incredible monuments and inventions that they could never do on their own and that they could never do in a village with just like one other person who knows how to make stuff, right? If you have 100 people who know how to make stuff get together, your chances are you're going to make something amazing. And that is part of what's fun, is revisiting those moments when we all thought we were doing the greatest thing ever. And it turned out that, people walked away from it and they didn't actually in the end think it was the greatest. And that seems to be kind of how cities work. I can't speak to civilizations because obviously civilizations are huge, broad movements that outlast cities. And all of the cities in this book, although they were abandoned by the people who lived there, the cultures and civilizations that kind of accumulated in those cities, those continued on. So civilization did not fall. It was just that the city itself was abandoned because of pretty mundane reasons, usually like bad management, unstable government, too many floods. In one case, a volcano did go off and bury the city in hot ash. So that was a kind of no brainer for leaving that city behind. But yeah, I think this was my long rambling way of saying that not every culture cares about being the number one civilization. I think that's a Western thing. And I think it's specifically like a kind of a relic of like colonialism and industrialization and capitalism, where we're all like, who's number one? Who has the most civilized civilization? And it's like, that's just another artifact of our culture, right? We've invented this idea of civilization. We think it's super badass. And like, in 50,000 years, people might have a really different set of ideas about what makes a good community. And it might not have anything to do with being number one. It might have to do with like, who has the tastiest acorn bread? We just don't know.
That sounds better, probably.
Yeah.
And what's the process behind the scenes then with a non-fiction book? Do you have to pitch that first? Is that like before you start writing it, or is it whereas with like a kind of fiction book, you can kind of write it and then try and shop it around type thing?
Yes. So that's a really good question. It is backwards in that way. Like with fiction, usually you have to have written the whole thing and then you pitch it. And with nonfiction, even though you'd think it might be a good idea to have written the whole thing before you pitch it, you just pitch with a really detailed outline. And the outline often includes like a big chunk of writing. Like you'll include sample chapters. So if you really want to sell the book for an amount of money you can live on, it does help to have written, maybe a quarter of the book already. So it isn't exactly like you haven't written anything. And you do have to do quite a bit of research first. And that's a bit unfair, but at the same time, it's, you have to show that you can actually pull off the book. So in my case, like I said, I had been researching this book for many years. And so I had actually traveled to a couple of the cities already and reported out from them, and really done a lot of legwork. And I was it's expensive to travel. And part of it was just that I really wanted to get a book deal because that way I could at least have covered my past expenses. So future Annalee could pay for past Annalee's trip to Cambodia. So the process is you do a lot of research, you do a lot of outlining, you do a lot of planning, and then you pitch it. And that was how I sold this book, was basically saying, I've done a bunch of the work. I also have a couple more cities to visit, and hopefully you're interested. And luckily they were.
Nice.
And with your writing process generally, are you someone that, we've heard that you like outlining and stuff, but do you revise as you go then, or do you sort of get a first draft done and then sit down and work through that? What's your process?
It's a bit of both. So I definitely do revisions as I go along. And then once I'm done, I think this is always the case with every book. When you're done, that's when you're like, oh, this is how this book should really be structured. And so there's usually one very, very intensive first revision. So there's a first draft, and then the first revision often it's pretty deep. Like I actually cut tons of stuff. I added a lot of stuff. I changed my opinion. I completely changed my opinion about one thing that I thought was settled. And then there'll be subsequent drafts after getting feedback from the editor. And then usually like a final polish. So, and that's the case with my novels too. Like I find my first drafts are just stinky. Like they're so bad. And, I think that's pretty common unless you're like Neil Stevenson, who apparently like writes everything like clean as a whistle the first time. But like I write garbage the first time, and that's actually the biggest hurdle for me to get over is like when I'm writing a first draft, it feels like I just feel so dumb when I'm doing it, or I feel so foolish, I should say. And I just have to be like, okay, I'm going to revise it. Like, I know that sentence is ugly and dumb. I hate it, but it's there now. So let's just let it steam.
But yeah, I think that's an important thing to say, isn't it? Because you do have to kind of push your way through these parts and say, I'm going to fix it. I will come back to it. Because I think a lot of people can get stuck on trying to make something perfect, and that can sometimes be a barrier to progressing at all.
It so much is. Every time I get blocked on something, it's always coming down to that. Like, it's always because I'm like, but each sentence doesn't feel beautiful to me. And it's like, okay, get over it. Like I said, the sentence is going to be poop. Eventually you'll put like gilding on the poop and no one will notice. Like they'll be like, oh, but it's so shiny, you know, like, don't look under the gilding.
And in the future, what would you ever want to, you've done fiction, non factual stuff, but would you ever want to do screenplays or comics? Was that something you'd ever want to go into, you think?
I definitely think screenplays would be fun. I did co-write a pilot for Autonomous. AMC awesome. had optioned it, and that's kind of floating in the Hollywood ether. Who knows what'll ever happen with that? But that was really fun. I was lucky that my writing partner Amanda Siegel is super experienced, so she kind of showed me the ropes. She had worked on Person of Interest, which was a show that I really loved.
Cool. Yeah.
And she's just such a pro. So that was really fun. I would totally do that again for another project. And I do have, managers in Hollywood who are like trying to get stuff going. But nothing I can really talk about. But I don't think I would ever do comics, just because I think comics is one of those things, kind of like video games, where I'm a fan of them, but I just don't think I could make them. And I just don't even want to try, because there's already good people doing it. So I can just be a fan.
Yeah, that's allowed sometimes.
Yeah,
and
once in a while.
So you're working on, it sounds like you're working on 2 books at the moment. You've got the fiction one and non-fiction one that you're working on.
It's true.
Yeah. How are you juggling those 2 projects?
Like sort of like one of those like TikToks where someone's trying to juggle, and then like the balls turn into cats, and like the cats turn into like demons or something. I've actually never seen a video like that, but that's how it feels. I try to do what I'm trying to do is I'm finishing up the novel, and I'm doing research for the nonfiction book, and then I'm hoping that when I finish the first draft of the novel, I can start writing the nonfiction book. I'm sure it'll be a lot messier than that and difficult, but it's fun to do them in parallel, especially because the topics are overlapping in kind of surprising ways. So we'll see how it goes.
Cool. Excellent. And one thing we always have to ask people at the moment is, obviously you're launching For Lost Cities at the present time, which is not your usual kind of book launch. I mean, how have you found that?
It's been weird. I have been on book tour. I am currently technically on book tour. I've done a number of virtual events that are sponsored by bookstores. So it does. Nice. It feels like I'm it feels like I'm moving around, but it's like, it's not quite it's not the same, you know, like going physically to meet people is so much more, well, we all know this, it's much more engaging. It feels much more like nourishing, for lack of a better word, but it's still pretty fun. I'm not crazy about airports, so it's nice to not have to fly everywhere. Yeah. But I think it's going okay. It's hard to tell because the other thing that's weird is that in the early days of the pandemic, you would go to a virtual event and you could see everyone's faces because people weren't using the webinar function on Zoom yet. And now everything is a frickin' webinar, which means you see your face and like maybe your your host's face or something, and then everybody else is just like a number at the bottom, and it feels really weird.
It's hard to get that. Is this landing, or do I need to adjust?
Totally.
Yeah, it's super strange. So I would say the most that I keep thinking that it reminds me a lot of lecturing when I was a lecturer at Berkeley, and like I'd have a class of like 300 students, and like at any given time, surely half of them were like sleeping or like distracted or whatever. And so I'm just like, okay, they're just like a bunch of people out there who are doing whatever they're doing. And I'm just going to keep talking.
What was the last book that you read?
Let's see. What was the last book that I read? I'm kind of in the middle of reading a bunch of books. So why don't I say the book that I last stuck my face into, which was this book, Kindred by Rebecca Ragg Sykes, just sitting here on my desk. It's about Neanderthals, and it's a science book, and it's about actually what was going on Earth about 50,000 years ago when there were multiple types of hominin hanging around and exchanging ideas and having babies together, and what those Neanderthals were really like. So it's pretty cool.
Cool.
Nice. And what about the last film that you watched?
Last film I watched, it was probably something silly. Mostly I'm watching TV. So what the hell was the last film I watched? It's so funny because like everything is on streaming now.
Yeah,
so it's
exactly.
like it all feels like it's coming from the same place. Like, was that a movie or was that television? Because it's like I watched Lupin, which is a mini series. So it's not strictly a movie, but it felt like that. So it was Promising Young Woman. That was what it was. So Promising Young Woman actually is a movie that's kind of in the same genre as Future of Another Timeline. It's about a woman who's engaging in what we call rape revenge. Rape revenge is like a whole kind of subcategory of cult movie. And all of my friends had been talking about how Promising Young Woman, I have to see it because of Future of Another Timeline. So I did. It's pretty good. Some problems with it, but yeah, it was okay. I think my next movie is going to be The Dig, which everyone keeps asking me about as well.
It's been everywhere. Yeah, I've not seen that.
Yeah, people are obsessed, and it's funny because because I've written this book about archaeology, and so they'll say like, "Did you see The Dig?" And I'm like, "Have you seen The Detectorists?" Because that's the true story of how archaeology nerds are, and it's such a sweet show. So anyway, I keep telling people to watch that.
Yeah, no, that's a great show. And I was going to ask as well the last TV show, but I think you said it was Lupin. Yeah.
Lupin. Actually, no, I'm finishing up season 2 of the Doom Patrol. I did watch Doom Patrol last night, a particularly upsetting episode. So
I can watch the first season of that, but I don't think I ever.
I watched the Titans. I saw the
that's
first,
what I'm thinking of.
the sort of episode in Titans, but I've not actually seen Doom Patrol itself.
It's pretty good. It's funny because Umbrella Academy and Doom Patrol are kind of almost the same show.
Mm-hmm.
And I've kind of watched them back to back. And so now I kind of have this sense of this new like emerging like dark X-Men type genre.
Yeah, totally.
I think that's basically what it's about. But yeah, Doom Patrol is pretty good.
Cool.
Awesome. And the very, very last thing we do is a quick fire, either or, and there's no right or wrong answer apart from potentially one. So the first one is Primer or Back to the Future?
Back to the Future.
Star Wars or Star Trek?
Oh, dude. I am completely bistellar. I do both. I will not pick.
Okay, fair enough.
Early bird or night owl?
Night owl.
TV or cinema?
TV, I guess. I don't know.
And the last one, audiobook or ebook?
Ebook.
And just to
wow, I got the right answer, I guess.
Exactly. Well, just to check, if we had said real book or ebook, what would your choice have been?
Oh, man. I guess, I mean, at this point, it's probably ebook just because it's easier to carry like 100 of them with me. You know what I mean?
Correct.
Yeah.
Answer.
Even though
you can come back on the show anytime.
Look, I have a hard copy of Kindred right here that I'm like touching and reading, and it's like it feels so nice on my fingers. But
see, for a book like that,
heavy.
do you not need it I find for like nonfiction, especially if it's for research or whatever, you want the hard copy of it rather than an ebook because it's not as easy to flick around.
Don't let him sway you. Stick to your guns.
I actually, well, having done a ton of research, I find it nicer to have research books as ebooks because then I can carry them. Like I said, so if I go somewhere on site and I'm like, okay, I have these 50 books here about the Paleolithic and they're like in my freaking backpack. That's really helpful. But a lot of academic
books and stuff and
yeah, and you can do highlighting and notes and stuff, although they're very hard to export from Kindle, which is extremely annoying. But yeah, unfortunately, a lot of academic books are not available as ebooks, which makes me really sad. So, but yeah, I still like hard books. I mean, you can see here, like I may have collected.
I was going to say that's a wonderful library shelf.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and that's only one side of the room. There's the other side of the room.
Oh, nice.
So all you're seeing for people who are not here with their eyes is just I have a lot of bookshelves.
So I really enjoyed that episode, but obviously I was shot down a couple of times there by Annalee on a couple of my ideas. But one of them,
fool yourself, Marco.
Exactly. But one of them, I agree with Annalee shooting me down, which was when I was talking about if you took a man from 1900 to 1950, and then the same man from 1950 to 2000, they'd suddenly notice a big change in that latter period. And actually, I think I got the example wrong because the example I'm thinking of, is that if you jump from sort of 1900 or the 1890s, to the middle of the 20th century, there have been so many big changes in that period that there would be more of a shock, cars, telephones, but also things like family units and all this sort of stuff starting to change, as opposed to the last 50 years, which, although there have been changes, they've been more incremental in a way. But at the same time, I do see what Annalee was saying, that you can explain the concepts of these changes to someone from 1800, but just say Twitter is just a quicker version of a letter and things like that. But,
yeah.
I think someone from 1800 would probably be quite shocked if they landed in 2021.
Well, Marco, we'll leave it to the listeners to decide if they accept you.
I know, I've just probably dug myself a deeper hole there. But anyway.
But no, it was a lot of fun and very interesting. And they've written a whole host of interesting stuff in there. You look through the catalogue that they've done, and it's short stories, non-fiction, fiction, articles. It's a really impressive, body of work, and some really interesting comments on how to break into the industry, how to write for blogs, and how to get yourself out there, make a bit of a name for yourself.
Absolutely. And yeah, I read Future of Another Timeline, which I enjoyed, but also equally a lot of Annalee's non-fiction stuff is really worth reading, and I will be picking up a copy of Four Lost Cities as well.
And of course, as we said at the start, next week's guest is also connected to io9. It is Charlie Jean Anders, who, along with Annalee, as we had learned in that episode, helped launch io9 and helped to be one of the first writers on that website.
Yeah, and Charlie's written a number of great novels, including All the Birds in the Sky, which was her big breakthrough novel, which won a lot of awards and is a really great sort of grounded sci-fi fantasy novel with a humorous edge, and highly recommend picking that up. But we talk about that more next week, along with her latest book, Victory is Greater Than Death, which is the first book in a new young adult trilogy that she's written.
Yeah, it's a really fun chat we have with her. And although there is some similar ground, I suppose, between her and Annalee Newitz in terms of io9 background, it's interesting just seeing the different routes that both of them have had into the writing industry, and how although there's a connection and a kind of jumping off point from there, they've both gone in very different spaces, and it's a really interesting chat.
Yeah, and it's as ever with all our guests, as we find, the routes into the industry, whatever part of writing you want to get into, it doesn't follow the accepted guidance, a lot of the accepted wisdom a lot of the time. But really worth tuning in for that one. And before we go, as always, I'll just ask that if you enjoyed the podcast, please do give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app you listen to, and a review, as long as it's good, would be even better. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.